Strategy refers to the way we govern an organization, all decisions involving resources and skills, which direct the company, as a leader of an army does with his soldiers. Strategy is a global process that takes time to set up and that brings together the organization's components around common places. 3 phases allow deploying the strategy. Choice of focus strategies, decision-making phase. Implementation of the strategy, operational phase. Strategic control, evaluation phase. It is important to note that some emerging elements can interfere with the decision-making phase and during the operational phase, this latter never corresponds exactly to the strategy at the beginning. However, one of the strategy's qualities is to constantly adapt itself to the needs of the organization, and it will certainly be necessary to adjust the strategy many times. The 3 phases of the strategic process will then be carried out according to the goals the organization wants to reach. We distinguish between the organization's mission, which corresponds to the assertion of its basic intent, its reason for being, in other words, its profession. The organization's vision, that is, what it wants to become. The goals or the measurable results to be reached. The values, how our organization wants to act, which refers to the concepts of culture and social responsibility of the company. Thus, throughout these 3 phrases, every component of the organization will implement the means necessary to go together in the same direction and to fulfill the same goals, just like an army of little soldiers. What is the strategy's use? Strategy is organized around 3 fundamental cornerstones. Value creation. The organization will try to create a value for the consumer via a chain of efficient and coherent activities, production, logistics, commercialization, services, etc. Competitive confrontation. This value creation will allow the organization to surpass the competition and to be preferred by the consumer over other organizations offering a similar or substitutable product. Choice of the strategy route. The choice of the organization's key activities. Strategic analysis from external to internal. The evaluation of an organization is a comprehensive work that not only consists in the application of financial valuation models. To carry out a valuation, we must understand the organization's activity and issues. But a general diagnosis of the organization's situation must also be made before starting the valuation phase itself. This analysis aims to understand the organization's working logic and its equilibrium on the market, in order to be able to make a judgment on its current financial position and its future prospects. It is essential for making decisions about funding, to grant a loan or not, to be financed by owner's equity or by debt, or investment, to invest or not in this company. It focuses on 2 points. 1. The economic understanding of the organization and the sector. 2. The accounting and financial analysis of the company. This analysis should be based on the collection of all available information on the organization, accounting and financial documents of the past 3 or 5 years, social balance sheet, auditor's reports, other documents produced by the company, annual reports, investor presentations, the website, public information and news for large organizations, and possibly an interview with the head of business and a visit of the organization. The first part consists in the analysis of the organization and its sector. The strategic analysis of the organization is carried out on several levels: commercial, legal, human, industrial, etc. It is about assessing the place of an organization on a market and in a sector, in order to diagnose its strengths and weaknesses that result from the economic situation, and the constraints related to jobs or business sectors. These points are indeed essential to the assessment, and serve as an orientation to guide the development of the business plan, to increase or lower the value of the organization, or to disclose all of the risks which are specific to the company. The strategic approach of the analysis requires two elements that are essential to the appreciation of the organization's diagnosis: its environment and its strategic capability. External analysis, opportunity and threat. As part of the strategic process, the environment in which the organization operates has to be taken into account in addition to its intrinsic goals. Indeed, the organization is part of an external environment of its own. It operates at the same time in a commercial, economic, political, technological, cultural, and social context. In order to understand how this external environment affects the organization, we need both an analysis of past events and an estimate of future developments. Some of these variables are able to generate opportunities for the organization, while others may, conversely, represent threats. It is difficult to analyze all these variables, and that's why we have to extract from these environmental forces a synthesis of the variables that truly influence the organization. The impact of contingent factors on the structure. Just like the agent is influenced in his decision-making, the organization too will be influenced by different factors when a solution to a given problem has to be found. Thus, the organization, its functioning, and the context in which it operates will all be linked. Companies organize themselves and follow intentional or unintentional strategies. Woodward, 1958, has shown in his work that structural organization was influenced by technology and other environmental factors. Continuing Woodward's work, Burns, 1961, measured the impact of technology on the organizational structure of electronics companies. This study demonstrated that technology had an influence on the structure of organizations. This influence can take several forms, organic or mechanical, according to the organization and the management's needs. Similarly, Lawrence and Lorsch, 1967, demonstrated that a market environment as well as a techno-economic and scientific environment had a strong influence on the organization of companies. However, the less we know about the company's environment, the more we need to differentiate between its departments. We can point out that uncertainty factors about the company's environment have a strong influence on the organization and that their analysis is essential to anticipate them, but also in order to maximize the company to better adapt and respond to market needs and to fight against its competitors. The organization's control by the environment. The environment differs from one organization to another. In order to be effective and efficient, it is necessary for the organization to adapt to its environment. However, some factors, internal or external, will limit this adaptation. Among these are costs, the difficulty for information to flow within the organization, the difficulty of obtaining information about the environment, the constraints of the internal policy of the organization, legal and tax barriers, etc. It is important to be aware that some forms of organizations are more compatible with some environments than with others. However, each organization will seek support from external groups and other organizations in order to better adapt to its environment. To do so, it will have to satisfy these external groups to then be able to draw resources from them. Thus, the organization and its survival will depend on these external groups, and that is why we speak of external control. Market, sector and environment concepts. An environment is divided into different parts, all of them being equally important. 1. The closest to the organization, we will be faced with strategic groups, also known as markets, which correspond to a group of homogeneous clients for a specific offer. 2. Then comes the sector, also called industry, which corresponds to all organizations providing goods or services identical or closely substitutable to ours, meeting the same needs. 3. Finally, the macro environment corresponds to the general components which can affect all organizations. The external analysis is ultimately an analysis of the sector from which we need to extract the following elements. 1. Description of the industry and key actors: monopoly, oligopoly, a great number of competitors, market share or intense competition. 2. Characteristics of the sector: development stage, mature or recent market, geographical locations, market size, turnover and sales volumes, market share by company, possibly legal elements or specific legislation for the sector. Prospects of the sector: general economic conditions of the market, significant events and recent developments, for example, a damaged or high-growth sector. 3. Specific issues: what are the sector's specific problems, for example innovations, environmental issues, etc. 4. Concentrations and restructurings: merging operations, acquisitions or restructurings recently carried out in the sector. Traditionally, economists and managers have campaigned to create a nearly perfect competition between companies with easy access to the markets in which they wish to intervene. However, from the perspective of strategic management, the question is to understand the competitors' actions. Organizations are affected by environmental conditions. Leaders must be aware of these conditions in order to embrace opportunities that can lead to higher profits, and that can reduce the impact of threats which hover over the organization's future. Managers need information in order to know and develop an understanding of what is happening in the external environment. The environment consists of all the factors outside the organization. It includes the macro environment as well as the micro environment. The environment is specific to each organization, but the current characteristics of the environment are the same: a complex, uncertain and unstable environment. Therefore, organizations which are open about their environment are forced to constantly adapt and evolve at the risk of being outdone by competition. When the environment is favorable to the organization, we speak of opportunities, favorable economic conditions, legislation and dynamic market. On the contrary, if it is unfavorable, we will speak of threats. The company's strategy will therefore consist in seizing opportunities and in diverting or circumventing threats. The goal is to turn threats into opportunities. The PESTEL Analysis. There are several tools for the analysis of the organization's environment. First, the PESTEL analysis refers to anything that might influence the organization, positively or negatively, and become a threat or an opportunity, or neutral, for it. The macro environment represents all the factors outside the company with which it has to comply and which constitute its framework. Depending on the organizations, this environment is more or less geographically remote. For many of them, especially the smaller ones, the environment is only local. For others, the environment is essentially national. Finally, larger companies operate in an international environment. The PESTEL analysis allows characterizing a market, assessing the different elements that may affect the business and identifying the environmental opportunities or threats of the organization. This analysis indicates the environmental influences based on an analytical chart that allows the identification of current and future structural trends and helps put into perspective the different development scenarios for the organization. The PESTEL analysis completes the sections of the external diagnosis to have a global picture of the company's general environment. PES stands for political, economic, socio-cultural and technology. It becomes PESTE when we add ecology, and PESTEL when a sixth axis, legislation, is added to the analysis. The analytical chart we have just established is divided into 6 categories, as shown in the following diagram. Political factors, tax policy, social protection, national and international political factors that can affect one's operations. They mainly come from government action, whether at a local, national or international level. They can be monetary, fiscal, regional, etc. Economic factors, economic cycle, interest rates, inflation and unemployment. Of course, they concern the immediate competition of your main competitors, but they are also subject to general economic conditions, cost of raw materials, interest rates, taxation, employment, purchasing power and behavior, etc. Sociological factors, demographics, consumer behavior, education level, etc. Items related to demographics, income distribution, consumer lifestyles, education, etc. Technological factors, public investments in research, obsolescence rate. Innovation has become a key element of a company's competitiveness. Are there new patents? Technological transfers? How to finance research and development? Environmental factors, environmental protection measures. The consumer is more and more attentive to this issue. What are the existing laws on environmental protection, energy trends, sustainable development, etc.? Legal factors, competition law, company law, labor law, study of standards, legislation, labor law and competition. It is important to note that, because a PESTEL analysis is the analysis of the organization's external environment, it must be applicable to all companies in the sector. Sector refer to what we just see before on the previous slide. Porter's 5 Forces Model. The main objective of the organization is to achieve a competitive advantage on its market. Thus, it is necessary to measure the intensity of competition that will surround the organization and to measure its ability to face this competitive environment. We will use Porter's 5 Forces model, to which a force, the government, was added later on, hence the name Porter's 5+1 Forces method. Michael Porter's 5+1 Forces model is a method used to study the structure of an industry, that is to say the nature and intensity of the competitive forces that shape its long-term profitability. The purpose of the analysis is to evaluate the long-term attractiveness or profit potential of the industry, to identify and understand the 5+1 structural forces that influence this profitability. As we have seen earlier, an industry can be defined as a group of companies presenting substitutable offers, for example the automobile industry or the aviation industry, while the market is a group of homogeneous customers for a specific offer. Threat of new entrants. The intensity of competition depends on the easy access to the industry. Barriers at the entry are the factors that new entrants have to overcome in order to compete with existing organizations. There are several types of barriers: financial, commercial, in terms of resources and skills, etc. Pressure from substitute goods. Substitutes are products or services providing an equivalent benefit to customers, but with a different approach. Always take into account value for money, innovation and cost structure. Competitive intensity, the rivalry between existing firms. The higher the competitive intensity is, the lower the industry's attractiveness. Buyers' bargaining power. Do buyers have the power to put pressure on the organization? Buyers can, for instance, influence the revision of falling prices. It is possible to reduce the bargaining power of buyers by multiplying the number of buyers and/or by ensuring that no buyer on his own accounts for a significant part of the company's turnover. Suppliers' bargaining power. A market is less attractive if suppliers are powerful or well organized. They can either reduce quantity or increase their prices. Just like buyers, it seems important to increase the number of suppliers while ensuring they do not create a situation of scarcity and thus of dependence for the organization. Key success factors. A key success factor, KSF, can be defined as a strategic element that the organization has to master in order to outperform the competition in a specific activity. The identification of key success factors stems from the analysis of strategic groups and of Porter's 5+1 forces model. Indeed, KSFs are specific to a given area and therefore cannot be generalized to all industries, Meyer, 2005. They are based on core competences and on the organization's ability to implement them in various processes, Theedart, 2005. As Theedart, 2005, pointed out, the control of these key success factors offers protection against competitors from other strategic groups in the same sector by creating real barriers to their mobility. The control of one or more KSFs can enable the organization to counteract the strengths identified by the matrix. Thus, KSFs, as they protect against competition and favor the organization's competitiveness, contribute to the creation of competitive advantage. One can also note that KSFs are related to the value creation from the customer's point of view. Johnson et al., 2011. However, organizations must be mindful of the KSF's risk of obsolescence. They must evolve with the environment, and especially the industry's life cycle. Meyer, 2005. Two types of KSFs can be identified. Meyer, 2005. 1. Those aiming to maintain the organization's competitive position. 2. Those aiming to strengthen the organization's position. To conclude, KSFs match the sources of the competitive advantage. The latter will come from the degree of control of each of the KSFs identified by the organization. The internal analysis, strengths and weaknesses. The resources and competences of the organization will allow it to build up its strategic capability. The evaluation of its strengths and weaknesses involves assessing what the organization does better or less well than its competitors, giving him either an advantage or disadvantage. It means defining the impact of influences and internal restrictions on strategic decisions. In some cases, a particular resource can be the source of a competitive advantage. This analysis fundamentally corresponds to an analysis of the organization, and what needs to be done is to extract the following information: history, activities and products, commercial performances, development strategy, management and human resources management, HRM, corporate governance and shares. All this information gives us a global vision of the organization and its sector, as well as an essential understanding of its risks and problems. Strategic capability. The school of resources to which we can link the notion of strategic capability emerged in the 1980s. However, it initially comes from Penrose's work, 1959. In his book entitled The Theory of the Growth of the Firm, the author examined the conditions which allow firms to grow. From the study of American firms, Penrose considers a firm as a set of tangible or intangible resources. Thus, according to her, what differentiates firms that succeed from others is the possession of distinctive resources. We shall therefore expand here these researches to organizations in general. Her theory was later the topic of many developments, including the resource-based view. This approach considers resources and capabilities as the starting point of competitive advantage and is based on the assumption that the competitiveness of an organization is intrinsic to it. As a result, the strategic capability of an organization is nothing more than the resources and competences of an organization needed for it to survive and to prosper. Johnson et al., 2011. Strategic capability will enable the organization to offer customers products whose value could increase. The resource-based view developed in the article of Wennerfeld, 1984, is therefore opposed to the theory arguing that the organization's performance is determined by the industry. In order to have an overall view of the strategic capability of an organization, it is necessary to analyze these different elements. 1. Value chain. 2. Resources. 3. Capabilities. 4. Finances. It should be noted that the theory of the resource-based view has however been criticized for its globally static vision of resources and competences. Thies, 1997, pointed out the fact that in order to get the longer-lasting advantage, strategic capability could not be strategic. In this case we speak of dynamic capability, which refers to a capacity to renew and develop their intangible resources almost continuously to meet the challenges of a volatile context. Johnson et al., 2011. The value chain analysis. Strategic capability can be examined through many tools: standardization, value chain, activities mapping, and the SWOT matrix. What we are interested in here is Porter's value chain, 1986. It allows us to identify the activities that contribute to the creation of value, which will allow the organization to differentiate itself from competitors and to gain a competitive advantage. Thus, the organization's offer can be valued by the clients. The chain is composed of primary functions, located at the bottom of the chain, and secondary functions, located at the top of the chain. Thus, these functions must give the organization the possibility to create a sufficient margin. The analysis of the value chain gives us a large overview of the organization's strategic capability. However, contrary to the business model, the value chain is an ex-post analysis tool, DeMille et al., 2004. The value network. The value network includes all the participants who will, from raw material to the finished product, provide an added value. As you saw in the previous diagram, all the participants in a value network have their own value chain. This notion is important in the sense that it will help us understand the actors' roles and the importance of each one of them in the business model of a product or a business value network. It is also important to note that some actors or some value network may lock some markets by deliberately limiting the number of actors or agreeing on non-competition. Resources analysis. After analyzing the value chain of the organization, it is interesting to focus, first, on the audit of its resources, and then, on the analysis of its competences. Resources are the means that the organization has at its disposal. That is, the means it owns within it, or the assets that the organization can quickly mobilize, meaning the resources available from its suppliers. By a resource is meant anything which could be thought of as a strength or weakness of a given firm. More formally, a firm's resources at a given time could be defined as those, tangible and intangible, assets which are tied semi-permanently to the firm. Wernerfeld, 1984, p. 132. The organization's resources can be either tangible or intangible. There are different types of resources: physical, financial, human resources, etc. Barney, 1986, 1991, in line with Wernerfeld, distinguished three types of resources: resources of physical capital, of human capital, and of organizational capital. Please note that the audit tools of the resources are specific to each discipline. There is no single common tool that would audit all the resources. Competences analysis. Competences are the different means the organization will put in place in order to mobilize the resources that are in its possession, the means through which the organization will use its resources. Having resources is not enough, it is also necessary to know how to mobilize them. Resources and competences are therefore equally important, and one cannot work without the other. Finally, Hamel and Prahalad, 1990, also contributed to the enrichment of the resource-based view theory by developing the concept of core competences. It is useless to think in terms of competitive advantage. Competitive advantage must rely on distinctive competences, resources and/or competences. Hamel and Prahalad, 1990, argue that distinctive competences are those that result from the combination of skill and technology and not from a particular skill or technology. The organization is therefore seen as a set of distinctive competences, built over time, which constitutes what they call core competences. The competitive advantage comes from the fact that the organization owns and mobilizes strategic capability, which differentiates it from its competitors. That is, core competences. The essential competences are the operations and processes through which resources are deployed in a way of getting a competitive advantage that is difficult to imitate. For example, a road transport company that would have a privileged connection with a large distribution company. Therefore, in order to survive, an organization must not only have a large number of essential resources for the customers, but it must also know how to manage them according to its competences. This idea also demonstrates that in order to have a competitive advantage, it is necessary to have strategic capabilities that competitors will not be able to equal. Competitive advantage. Strategic segmentation and strategic business units. The organization is divided into different strategic business units, SBUs. A strategic business unit represents a field of business of the organization corresponding to the elements below: business unit, geographical sector, necessary, resources, and key success factors. The global strategy of the organization is divided into different sub-strategies corresponding to different strategic business units. These sub-strategies are usually called generic competitive strategies. The creation of competitive advantage. The concept of competitive advantage comes from Michael Porter in his work Competitive Advantage, published in 1985. Following Competitive Strategy, Techniques for Analyzing Industries and Competitors, 1980, in which he examined industry, Porter chose to focus on companies in this work, which we will extend to organizations in general here. Except in case of monoactivity, it is important to note that the internal analysis must focus on the target strategic business unit. Indeed, the competitive advantage can be obtained in a very different way according to the strategic business unit of the group. 1. Competitive advantage through cost. This advantage will gradually be set up as the company acquires an efficient productivity. This notion emphasizes the theory of learning from experience. Indeed, the employees will be more and more experienced over time, the tools and methods will be tested and improved, etc. The work processes will be assimilated and optimized, thus creating an increase in productivity. As a result, this cost reduction will create a barrier around the activity sector of the company. Competitive advantage through differentiation. Porter mentioned two types of differentiations, the first according to the products and the second according to cost. Product differentiation is made through the creation of a competitive advantage on the specialization of the offer. Thus, the organization will escape from a direct competition through price since its supply becomes small compared to that of its competitors. Product differentiation through prices allows the company to establish itself with a favorable position on the market. Competitors cannot afford to reduce their prices that much, therefore all customers go to the company offering the cheaper similar item. The differentiation strategy can be divided into four major strategies: improvement strategy, low-cost strategy, limitation strategy and specialization strategy. Niche strategy. The niche or concentration strategy consists in the company's concentration on a very narrow market where few competitors can turn up because it involves a particular technological specialization or a very close circle between production and brand. Therefore, very few competitors can enter this market and the company fully enjoys specialization advantages, with few competitors and a larger margin. Then the point is to be able to sustain this considerable advantage connected to products, markets and technology, by perfectly controlling its production cost, improving as much as possible the quality offered and mainly by innovating. Indeed, innovation makes it possible to sustain a substantial competitive advantage for the company thanks to RAND. We have seen different types of competitive advantage, those connected to products, to markets, to technology, but there are also short-term advantages, which disappear over time. Henceforth, a new advantage comes into play on a long-term basis, the business model. The strategic capability should not be forgotten. It allows the creation of a competitive advantage through value, that is, by meeting the precise expectations of customers rather than by focusing on operational efficiency, cost reduction or shares return. Customers must be able to get what they want, that is the real value. Strategic capability must also be rare so that it can be a competitive advantage, in other words, it should not have an equivalent in the competition. Lastly, toughness, which is divided into three sources, complexity, culture and history, and ambiguity, is also essential to bring inimitability in their strategic capability. Porter proposed a list of strategic options to create a competitive advantage. Brand image. Price policy. Services linked to product offer. Technology policy, leadership or imitator. The selection of distribution channels, is the sales system turned towards the consumers or the wholesaler? A strategic map can be drawn according to the different meanings of these factors between competitors aiming at the same segments. The BCG Matrix. The Boston Consulting Group Matrix is a strategic analysis tool which enables a company to know to what strategic business unit it is more essential to allocate resources. The matrix makes it possible to place SBU according to two approaches: the relative market share, that is, the relative market of our SBU compared to that of the major competitor, and the growth rate of the market. The size of the bubbles representing the SBU is proportional to their significance in the turnover of the organization. Some operations will require more investments than others, especially beginning operations, and the BCG matrix helps the organization to balance its business portfolio. Thank you for your attention. Subscribe to the channel.